There is a profound, suffocating kind of tragedy reserved for the child who is born into a kingdom of immense wealth, only to be treated like an embarrassing peasant by the very people meant to love her. For 28 years, I believed that my worth was dictated by my inability to conform to my family's rigid, elitist standards of perfection. My name is Dulce Whitford, and I was the designated disappointment of the Whitford real estate dynasty, a family whose name was etched into the marble facades of Manhattan hospitals and the brass plaques of high society museums. But behind the velvet ropes and the perfectly manicured public image, my childhood was a psychological war zone. I was diagnosed with severe dyslexia at the age of 7. While other children saw stories and adventures in books, I saw a chaotic, swimming sea of letters that stubbornly refused to anchor themselves to the page. Instead of offering me patience, specialized support, or even basic parental empathy, my parents, Gerald and Priscilla Whitford, viewed my learning disability as a personal insult to their genetic legacy. They shamed me relentlessly. At elegant dinner parties, they would laughingly refer to me as their slow one, a cruel punchline served with expensive champagne. They openly excluded me from conversations about the family business, treating me as if my inability to read quickly equated to a total lack of intellect. But the deepest cuts always came from the glaring, inescapable contrast between me and my sister, Miranda. Miranda was the undeniable golden child, a girl whose academic prowess was treated like a religion in our household. While my quiet pleas for reading specialists were dismissed by my mother as a waste of money on a lost cause, my parents happily poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into Miranda's future. They paid $400 an hour for Princeton-educated SAT tutors, funded her private Juilliard violin instructors, and shipped her off to French immersion camps in Paris. She was molded, polished, and primed to collect Ivy League degrees and inherit the sprawling Whitford empire. For 2 decades, I lived in the dark, freezing shadow of her golden pedestal, accepting my role as the flawed, disposable daughter. They thought they had successfully written me out of the family's future, entirely convinced that their cruel hierarchy was absolute. But they made one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation driven by their own blinding arrogance. They forgot that the true architect of the Whitford Empire was quietly watching us all from the head of the table. And while my parents were busy plotting to hand the kingdom to the golden child, they had no idea that the queen had already secretly rewritten the entire will, and she had chosen the scapegoat. The dichotomy of our upbringing was not merely a matter of differing expectations. It was a systemic, psychological dismantling of my self-esteem. My father, Gerald, was a man who worshipped at the altar of prestige. To him, a person's value was calculated exclusively by the diplomas on their wall and the names they could drop at the country club. My mother, Priscilla, was his perfect counterpart, a woman whose entire identity was wrapped in the superficial validation of her high society peers. Having a daughter who struggled to read a standard menu was a blemish on her pristine, country club image. "Dulce, please," my mother would sigh, snatching a menu from my hands at a restaurant while her friends watched. "Just order the chicken, we don't have all night for you to decipher the appetizers. It's embarrassing." Miranda, sitting across from me, would offer a practiced, pitying smile that didn't reach her cold eyes. "It's fine, Mother. She just needs more time. Not everyone is built for speed." Miranda had mastered the art of weaponized sympathy early on. She learned that by highlighting my deficits, she could effortlessly elevate her own status. She was the perfect, high-achieving daughter who never failed to remind everyone of her straight-A GPA, her debate team victories, and her eventual acceptance into Harvard. She was the heir apparent, the child my father proudly paraded through the executive floors of Whitford Properties, grooming her to eventually take his place. I was given a different path. While Miranda was handed the keys to the kingdom, I was handed a mop and a broom, metaphorically speaking. I was directed toward menial, low-stakes administrative jobs, told that I should aim for a simple life that wouldn't tax my limited capabilities. I internalized their cruelty so deeply that I began to believe it. I believed I was stupid. I believed I was unworthy of the Whitford name. I believed that the only way to survive in my family was to remain as small, as quiet, and as invisible as possible. But the one thing my parents failed to recognize was that dyslexia had forced me to develop a completely different set of skills. Because I could not rely on the written word, I learned to read the world around me. I learned to read people. I learned to analyze the micro-expressions on a boardroom executive's face, the subtle shifts in body language during a negotiation, and the underlying motivations that drove human behavior. I possessed a profound, intuitive emotional intelligence, a macro-strategic vision that Harvard could never teach, and I wasn't the only one who recognized it. There was one person in the Whitford family who saw past the swimming letters and the cruel jokes. One person who recognized that the true strength of a dynasty isn't built on academic elitism, but on resilience, grit, and character. To truly understand the magnitude of my family's arrogance, one must understand the origin of the empire they so desperately clung to. Whitford Properties was not a legacy of old, inherited money passed down from some aristocratic patriarch. It was a $92 million commercial real estate behemoth built from absolute scratch, fueled by the blood, sweat, and undeniable brilliance of my grandmother, Eleanor Whitford. Eleanor was a force of nature, a woman who defied every expectation of her era. In 1965, long before women were welcomed in the cutthroat, male-dominated world of New York real estate, she opened a tiny, windowless office in Brooklyn. She started with nothing but a small loan, an ironclad will, and a terrifyingly sharp instinct for property valuation. She bought derelict buildings in forgotten neighborhoods, renovated them with her own hands when she couldn't afford contractors, and slowly, methodically built an empire that eventually commanded the Manhattan skyline. My father, Gerald, loved to act as if he were the mastermind behind the company's success. He wore the bespoke suits, gave the interviews to Forbes, and played the role of the visionary CEO. But the truth, known only to those within the innermost circle of the company, was that Gerald was merely a caretaker, a mediocre manager who inherited a perfectly tuned machine and took credit for its horsepower. Eleanor had handed him the reins of the daily operations when her health began to decline, but she had never relinquished her absolute, legal control of the board. Eleanor was a quiet, observant woman in her twilight years. She lived in a sprawling, classic pre-war apartment overlooking Central Park, filled with the scent of old paper and Earl Grey tea. She was the only person in the family who never made me feel small. When I was 12, reeling from a particularly brutal dinner where my father had mocked my failing grade on a history exam, I had retreated to Eleanor's library, hiding in the corner with hot tears streaming down my face. She had found me there, sitting on the plush Persian rug. She didn't offer hollow platitudes or tell me to try harder. She sat down beside me, her joints popping, and placed a weathered, calloused hand over mine. "Do you know why I bought the Harrison building in 78, Dulce?" she asked, her voice a gravelly, comforting rasp. I shook my head, wiping my eyes. Every man in a suit told me it was a bad investment. They looked at the cracked foundation and the peeling paint, and they said it was worthless. "They only saw what was broken on the surface," she said, squeezing my hand. But I looked at the steel beams underneath. I looked at the bones. The foundation was stronger than anything they were building at the time. I bought it for pennies, and today it brings in $2 million a year. She leaned in, her sharp, intelligent eyes locking onto mine. "Your parents look at you, and they only see what you struggle to do. They only see the surface. But I see your bones, Dulce. I see the way you watch the room. I see the way you understand people. You have my steel. Never let people who only know how to read books tell you how to read the world." Those words became my secret armor, a hidden reservoir of strength that I drew upon every time my mother sighed at my slowness or my sister flaunted her accolades. But as Eleanor's health faded, her presence at family gatherings diminished. She became a silent observer, sitting at the head of the long mahogany dining table in her wheelchair, watching the family dynamic unfold with a quiet, calculating intensity. She watched as Gerald and Priscilla fawned over Miranda's Harvard acceptance letters. She watched as they actively excluded me from discussions about the company's future. She watched the casual cruelty, the toxic favoritism, and the sheer, blind entitlement that had infected the family she had bled to establish. My parents assumed Alina's silence was a sign of her fading cognitive abilities. They thought she was simply a frail old woman passing quietly into the night, perfectly content to let Gerald inherit the master shares and pass the crown to Miranda. They didn't realize that Alina's silence was not the silence of a woman fading away. It was the silence of a judge who had already delivered her verdict. When Alina passed away peacefully in her sleep 6 months before Miranda's college graduation, the family briefly paused to wear black and mourn the matriarch. But beneath the veneer of sorrow, there was a palpable, greedy excitement in my parents' eyes. They believed the final obstacle to their absolute control had been removed. Gerald immediately moved his belongings into Alina's grand corner office at the headquarters, acting as if the empire was finally, irrevocably his. The estate lawyers informed the family that Alina's final trust and the master shares of Whitford properties were locked in a complex probate period and would be officially dispersed later in the year. Gerald, arrogant and utterly secure in his delusion, didn't push it. He assumed it was a mere formality. He assumed the golden child and the golden father had won. He had no idea that Alina had spent her final years meticulously laying a legal minefield, and the detonator was already set. The celebration of Miranda's graduation from Harvard was less a family party and more a lavish, high-society coronation. My parents had rented out the grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan, an iconic, drippingly opulent venue that commanded tens of thousands of dollars just to walk through the doors. The guest list boasted 350 of the city's most elite figures: real estate developers, venture capitalists, politicians, and socialites. It was a calculated display of power and wealth, designed exclusively to announce to the world that Miranda Whitford was the brilliant, beautiful future of the Whitford Empire. I was expected to attend, of course, but only to serve as the dull, unremarkable background against which Miranda's brilliance could shine even brighter. The night of the gala, the ballroom was a sensory overload of wealth. Towering floral arrangements of white orchids and imported roses dominated the tables. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, glittering light over the sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer gowns. A 12-piece orchestra played softly in the corner, while waiters carrying silver trays of champagne and caviar wove seamlessly through the crowd. I wore a simple, understated navy dress, a deliberate choice to avoid drawing any attention to myself. As I entered the ballroom, my mother immediately intercepted me near the coat check. She was wearing a stunning, custom Vera Wang gown, her neck dripping in diamonds that probably cost more than the average American home. "Dulce, finally," Priscilla hissed, grabbing my elbow with a grip that bruised. Her eyes swept over my dress with visible distaste. "Try to mingle, but please do not bring up your current employment situation if anyone asks. If someone from the board speaks to you, just tell them you're finding yourself. And whatever you do not hover around Miranda when the photographers from the Times are circulating. Tonight is about her achievements." "Understood, Mother," I replied, my voice completely flat. I was used to the drill. I was the family's dirty little secret, the defective product they had to keep hidden on the back shelf. I retreated to the margins of the ballroom, holding a single glass of club soda, watching the spectacle unfold. My father, Gerald, was holding court near the grand ice sculpture, his face flushed with expensive scotch and unearned pride. He was introducing Miranda to a circle of elite venture capitalists. "This is the girl who is going to take Whitford properties into the 21st century," Gerald boomed, wrapping a heavy arm around Miranda's shoulders. "Harvard summa cum laude, she has the mind of a shark gentleman. Once the probate clears on my mother's estate, I'll be transitioning her directly onto the executive board as the vice president of acquisitions. She's the future." Miranda offered a brilliant, practiced smile, effortlessly engaging the older men in a discussion about macroeconomic real estate trends. She was performing the role she had been groomed for her entire life, completely intoxicated by the power and the adulation. She looked over the heads of the investors, caught my eye across the room, and offered a tiny, condescending smirk. The sheer injustice of it burned in my chest, a hot, suffocating coal. I had spent my entire life being told I was less than, simply because my brain processed letters differently. I had been systematically starved of affection and opportunity, while the people who had emotionally abused me were currently toasting to their own glorious, unearned future. As the evening progressed toward its climax, the master of ceremonies, a prominent local politician my father had bought, stepped up to the grand podium. The orchestra faded, and the crowd of 350 elites turned their attention to the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests," the politician boomed into the microphone. "Tonight, we are not just celebrating an extraordinary academic achievement. We are celebrating a legacy. We are celebrating the continuation of the Whitford dynasty. Please raise your glasses to Gerald, Priscilla, and the woman of the hour, the brilliant Miranda Whitford." The room erupted into thunderous applause. Glasses clinked. Camera flashes went off in a blinding staccato rhythm. My father beamed, raising his champagne flute high in the air while my mother wiped away a perfectly choreographed tear. Miranda stepped forward to take the microphone, ready to deliver her grand, victorious speech. It was the pinnacle of their lives, the absolute height of their arrogance. And it was in that exact, glittering moment of triumph that a tall, imposing man in a tailored charcoal suit slipped through the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom. He didn't look at the stage. He didn't look at the golden child. His sharp, hawk-like eyes scanned the margins of the room until they locked directly onto me. He began to walk toward me, cutting through the crowd of billionaires and socialites with the lethal, silent purpose of a torpedo locking onto its target. He was about to deliver the weapon that would blow their kingdom to ash. The man approached me near the shadow of a massive marble pillar, entirely unbothered by the grand speech Miranda had just begun to deliver on stage. I recognized him instantly, though I hadn't seen him in person for years. It was Thomas Sterling, the founding partner of Sterling, Vance, and Hughes, the most terrifying cutthroat corporate litigation firm in Manhattan. More importantly, he was grandmother Eleanor's personal attorney, the executor of her estate, and the only man she had trusted implicitly for the last 3 decades of her life. Thomas Sterling did not attend parties. He did not mingle. When a man like Sterling entered a room, it meant a legal guillotine was about to drop. "Ms. Dulce," Thomas said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that barely registered over the sound of Miranda's amplified voice echoing through the ballroom. "Mr. Sterling," I replied, my heart suddenly hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "What are you doing here?" He didn't offer a polite smile. He reached inside the breast pocket of his bespoke jacket and withdrew a thick, heavy cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with dark red wax, bearing the unmistakable, intricate crest of Eleanor Whitford's personal signet ring. "Your grandmother left very specific instructions regarding the timeline of her estate's execution," Thomas explained, his eyes darting briefly toward the stage where Gerald was nodding proudly at his golden child. "She instructed me to hold all distributions, all notifications, and all legal transfers until exactly 9:00 p.m. on the night of Miranda's graduation gala. She wanted them to reach the absolute height of their assumptions before we corrected them." He held the heavy envelope out to me. "This is not a copy, Dulce. These are the original, irrevocable mandates of the Eleanor Whitford Trust. I strongly suggest you find a quiet place to read them. My entire litigation team is waiting in the private executive suite on the top floor of this hotel. We are ready to execute your orders the moment you give them." I stared at the envelope, my hands trembling slightly as I reached out and took it. The parchment was thick, expensive, and carried the faint, ghostly scent of Earl Grey tea and old paper. The weight of it in my hands felt like holding a live explosive. "Mr. Sterling, what is this?" I breathed, looking up at his stoic face. It is exactly what she promised you in the library all those years ago, Thomas said softly, a flicker of genuine respect warming his cold eyes. It is the foundation. With a sharp nod, Thomas Sterling turned and vanished back into the crowd, leaving me standing in the shadows, holding the key to my entire existence. I couldn't breathe. The air in the ballroom suddenly felt impossibly thin, thick with the smell of expensive perfume and the suffocating sound of Miranda's voice thanking her visionary parents for their unwavering support. I needed air. I needed silence. I slipped out of the ballroom through a side door used by the catering staff, rushing down a quiet, carpeted hallway until I found an empty bridal staging suite. I closed the heavy door, locking it behind me, and leaned against the wood, gasping for breath. The silence of the room was a jarring contrast to the roaring gala just down the hall. I walked over to a small, antique writing desk, turned on the brass reading lamp, and sat down. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely break the wax seal. I slid my fingernail under the flap, tearing the heavy paper open. Inside was a stack of dense legal documents, bound by a silver clip, and a single, handwritten letter on Alina's personal stationery. I set the legal documents aside. Because of my dyslexia, reading dense legalese was an exhausting, slow process. But I didn't need to read the corporate jargon to understand what was happening. I picked up the handwritten letter. The letters swam for a moment, blurring together as my anxiety spiked, but I forced myself to breathe, to focus, to let the words anchor themselves. "My dearest Dulce," the letter began, Alina's slanted, forceful handwriting leaping off the page. "If you are reading this, it means Gerald and Priscilla are currently in the ballroom, celebrating their golden child and patting themselves on the back for a kingdom they did not build. For years, I sat at the head of that table in silence, watching the people I raised mistreat the most valuable person in the room. They worship paper. They worship degrees and status and the superficial speed at which a person can recite a textbook. They look at your sister and they see a trophy. They look at you and they see a failure. But I built my empire in the mud, Dulce. I built it fighting men who thought I was weak because I was a woman. I know what real strength looks like. Real strength is not getting a perfect score on an exam that your parents paid a tutor to help you pass. Real strength is surviving a household that actively tries to break your spirit every single day and still retaining your kindness, your observation, and your grace. Gerald is a fool. He is a caretaker who believes he is a king. Miranda is a parrot, repeating the arrogance she was taught. If I leave my life's work to them, they will drive it into the ground in a decade, blinded by their own hubris. Whitford Properties requires a leader who knows how to look at the broken foundation and see the steel underneath. It requires a leader who knows what it feels like to be underestimated, because that is the person who will never underestimate an opponent. I have bypassed the standard probate process. I have bypassed my son. I have bypassed the golden child. Attached to this letter are the irrevocable trust documents transferring 92% of the voting shares of Whitford Properties, all associated liquid assets, and the absolute controlling interest of the board of directors directly to you. You are the sole heir, Dulce. You are the CEO. Your father is merely an employee serving at your pleasure. Your sister has no equity, no position, and no future in my company. Do not shrink yourself anymore. Do not hide in the corners of their parties. Walk back out there, take your empire, and show them exactly how dangerous the slow one can be. With all my love and all my steel, Alina." A single tear detached from my lashes, dropping onto the heavy parchment, blurring the dark ink of my grandmother's signature. I read it again. And then a third time, the words embedding themselves deep into the very marrow of my bones. I wasn't the scapegoat. I wasn't the broken, defective daughter. I was the chosen heir of a $92 million empire. The woman who had built the kingdom had looked at all of us, weighed our souls, and decided that the girl who struggled to read was the only one smart enough to rule. I put the letter down and picked up the legal documents. I read the summary page, the bold, black letters stark against the white paper. Transfer of absolute control. Sole beneficiary, Dulce Whitford. The fear, the anxiety, the decades of internalized shame, It all evaporated, incinerated by a blinding, white-hot fire of absolute vindication. My father thought he was the king. Miranda thought she was the heir. They were currently standing on a stage, throwing a party funded by money that legally belonged to me. I stood up from the antique desk. I smoothed the wrinkles from my simple navy dress, picked up the stack of documents, and unlocked the door. The timid, invisible girl who had hidden in the coat check area was dead. The CEO was walking back into the ballroom. I moved down the carpeted hallway, the muffled sounds of applause and swelling orchestral music growing louder with every step. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It was beating with a slow, heavy, rhythmic thud, pumping liquid nitrogen through my veins. The heavy mahogany doors to the grand ballroom loomed ahead, guarded by 2 event staff members who stepped aside as I approached. I pushed the doors open and walked back into the blinding light of the gala. The scene was exactly as I had left it, only heightened by the intoxicating fumes of climax. Miranda had just finished her speech. She was standing at the grand podium, holding a crystal flute of champagne, basking in a standing ovation from 350 millionaires. My father was on the stage beside her, his chest puffed out like a peacock, waiting for the applause to die down so he could deliver his final, triumphant toast. I didn't walk to the margins this time. I walked straight down the center aisle, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The crowd was focused entirely on the stage, so my approach went largely unnoticed until I reached the front row. I bypassed the VIP tables where my mother was sitting, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. I walked up the 3 carpeted steps onto the grand stage. My father saw me first. The proud, beaming smile on his face faltered, instantly morphing into a scowl of deep, furious embarrassment. "Dulce, what are you doing?" Gerald hissed, stepping toward me and grabbing my upper arm in a bruising grip, attempting to drag me back toward the stairs before the crowd noticed the interruption. "Get off the stage. Are you insane?" "You're ruining Miranda's moment. Get back to the coat room." "Let go of my arm, Gerald," I said, my voice dangerously low, entirely stripped of the submissive daughter he had bullied for 28 years. He blinked, stunned by the sheer, cold authority in my tone. His grip loosened just enough for me to pull my arm away. I stepped past him and walked directly to the podium, stopping right beside Miranda. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, a look of profound, aristocratic confusion wrinkling her perfect features. "Dulce, seriously, go sit down," Miranda whispered, offering a tight, strained smile to the audience to mask the confrontation. "You're embarrassing us." I ignored her. I reached out and took the microphone from the stand. The low murmur of the 350 guests died instantly. The clinking of glasses stopped. A thick, heavy silence fell over the grand ballroom as the city's elite stared up at the stage, utterly bewildered by the sudden appearance of the quiet, unremarkable sister. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers, carrying a resonant, unshakable power I didn't know I possessed. "I apologize for the interruption. My father and my sister have delivered beautiful speeches tonight about the future of Whitford Properties. They have spoken at length about legacy, about inheritance, and about the brilliant future Miranda is meant to lead." I paused, looking out over the sea of faces, before turning my head to look directly into my father's furious, panicked eyes. "But there is a fatal flaw in their presentation," I continued, the microphone amplifying the cold, razor-sharp edge of my words. "They are making promises with a company they do not own." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The silence shattered into a frenzy of shocked whispers. "What the hell are you doing?" Gerald roared, completely losing his temper. He lunged toward me, his face purple with rage. "Cut her microphone. Security, get her off the stage. She's having a breakdown." "I am not having a breakdown, father," I said, holding up my hand to stop him, simultaneously slamming the heavy stack of legal documents onto the acrylic podium. The loud smack of the paper hit the microphone, reverberating like a gunshot. "I am executing a hostile takeover." I turned back to the stunned audience. For the last 6 months, following the death of my grandmother, Eleanor Whitford, My father has operated as the interim CEO of this empire. He has assumed that the master shares of the company would transfer directly to him once probate cleared, allowing him to hand an executive vice presidency to his golden child. I gestured to Miranda, who was currently trembling, the color completely drained from her face. But a leaner Whitford was a woman who valued true strength over superficial accolades, I declared, my voice rising over the chaos of the room. She saw exactly how this family operated. She saw the toxic arrogance, the nepotism, and the sheer incompetence masking as leadership. And she decided to cut the rot out of the foundation before it could destroy the building. I held up the cream-colored envelope with a leaner's wax seal, ensuring the investors in the front row could clearly see the legendary insignia of the company's true founder. I am holding the irrevocable mandates of the Eleanor Whitford Trust, executed tonight by her personal attorney, Thomas Sterling, I announced to the paralyzed room. Eleanor completely bypassed Gerald Whitford. She completely bypassed Miranda. She placed 92% of the voting shares, the absolute controlling interest of the board of directors, and the entirety of her liquid estate into a blind trust. I looked my father dead in the eye, delivering the final killing blow. And I am the sole beneficiary. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom imploded. It was as if I had detonated a flashbang directly over the stage. Venture capitalists in the front row were leaping out of their chairs, cell phones already in their hands, as they scrambled to call their analysts and lawyers. The polite, high society facade of the gala disintegrated into absolute, chaotic panic. Liar. My mother, Priscilla, shrieked from the VIP table, her composure shattering completely as she stood up, her diamond necklace flashing under the harsh lights. You lying, pathetic little girl. Gerald, do something. She's humiliating us. You shut your mouth. Gerald bellowed at me, spit flying from his lips as he lunged forward, grabbing the legal documents off the podium. His hands were shaking violently as he tore through the pages, his eyes frantically scanning the dense legal text. He was looking for the mistake, looking for the loophole, looking for proof that his dyslexic, scapegoat daughter couldn't possibly have outsmarted him. But as his eyes tracked over the bold, black signatures, the notary seals, and the indisputable transfer of power, the rage in his face was rapidly eclipsed by a profound, suffocating terror. He looked at the paper, and then he looked at me. The arrogant king suddenly realized he was standing on a trapdoor, and I held the lever. No, Gerald gasped, his chest heaving, the documents trembling in his grip. No, this isn't possible. She wouldn't do this. She wouldn't leave my company to a defective, slow girl who can barely read a balance sheet. She didn't leave it to a defective girl, Gerald, I said, stepping right into his personal space, forcing him to look into my eyes. I didn't whisper. I spoke clearly into the microphone so the entire room could hear the destruction of his ego. She left it to the only person in this family who actually understands how to read people. She left it to the person who survived your emotional abuse for 28 years without turning into a monster. And she was right. You aren't a CEO. You're a caretaker who forgot he was just renting the house. Miranda, who had been standing frozen in shock, suddenly snapped. The golden child, facing the instantaneous evaporation of her guaranteed billionaire future, panicked. Dulce, please, Miranda stammered, her voice shrill and desperate as she grabbed my arm. This is insane. You can't run a real estate empire. You're dyslexic. You don't even have a business degree. If you take control, the investors will pull out. You'll destroy everything Grandma built. I looked down at the hand grabbing my arm, the same hand that had mockingly offered to help me read menus to embarrass me in front of her friends. I slowly, deliberately pulled my arm away. I won't destroy it, Miranda, I said, turning to address the crowd of terrified investors and board members who were watching the family drama unfold with morbid fascination. Whitford Properties was built on grit, instinct, and a fundamental understanding of foundational value. For the last decade, Gerald has alienated our top contractors, over-leveraged our commercial assets, and coasted on the momentum my grandmother generated. He planned to install a 22-year-old with zero real-world experience as vice president simply because she shared his DNA and possessed an Ivy League degree. I locked eyes with the lead investors in the front row. "That nepotism ends tonight," I declared, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. As the majority shareholder and the new chief executive officer of Whitford Properties, I am initiating a comprehensive, top-down restructuring of the executive board. We are not a vanity project. We are a real estate firm. And the adults are back in charge. I turned back to my father, who was staring at me with a mixture of sheer hatred and helpless devastation. He looked at the hundreds of elites in the room, realizing that his public humiliation was absolute. He had thrown a massive, impossibly expensive party to crown himself king, only to be publicly castrated and fired by the daughter he had treated like garbage. "You are no daughter of mine," Gerald spat, his voice shaking with a pathetic, impotent rage. "I am Aliner's granddaughter," I replied, cold and unyielding. "And you are officially terminated. Clear your desk by Monday morning. I'll have security escort you out if you take anything that belongs to the company." The immediate aftermath of the gala was a masterclass in the pathetic, scrambling nature of narcissists who have suddenly lost their power source. Within 48 hours, the power dynamic of the Whitford family didn't just shift, it completely inverted. I left the Plaza Hotel that night, flanked by Thomas Sterling's security detail, leaving my parents and sister standing in the ruins of their expensive party. I checked into the penthouse suite of a luxury hotel downtown, spending the early hours of the morning with the litigation team, drafting the official corporate mandates. At 8:00 a.m. the next morning, I walked into the monolithic glass headquarters of Whitford Properties. I didn't go to the windowless basement office where they used to hide me. I took the private executive elevator directly to the top floor, bypassed my father's sprawling corner suite, and unlocked the heavy oak doors of Aliner's grand, preserved office. I sat behind her massive desk, running my hands over the polished wood, feeling the sheer, undeniable weight of my birthright. By noon, the frantic backpedaling began. My phone rang incessantly. It was my mother, Priscilla. The woman who had sneered at my clothes and shamed my intelligence for decades was suddenly leaving frantic, tearful voicemails. "Dulce, sweetheart," her recorded voice pleaded, dripping with a sickeningly sweet, manufactured desperation. "Please, let's talk about this. Family is family. Your father is so stressed, his blood pressure is through the roof. We can work this out. Miranda is willing to work under you. You need us to help you navigate the high society circles. Please, don't cut us out. We love you." I listened to the voicemails with a detached, clinical fascination. It was staggering how quickly the slow one became "sweetheart" the exact second I held the keys to the vault. They didn't love me. They loved the $92 million they thought they were entitled to. I didn't return her calls. I didn't need to. I instructed Thomas Sterling to handle all communications with my immediate family. The severance was absolute and merciless. I formally terminated Gerald's employment with Whitford Properties, citing gross mismanagement and fiduciary negligence based on the early audits Thomas Sterling's team uncovered. Because Aliner had technically owned the massive suburban estate my parents lived in under the corporate umbrella, I issued them a formal, legal notice to vacate within 60 days. They were not left entirely destitute. Aliner had mandated a modest, unbreakable trust fund to provide them with a basic, middle-class living stipend. But the private jets, the unlimited black cards, and the suffocating, unearned power they wielded were gone forever. Miranda, stripped of her guaranteed executive role and the infinite wealth she required to maintain her socialite status, panicked. She attempted to leverage her Harvard degree into a high-level position at a rival real estate firm, but news of her public humiliation and the total loss of her family's backing made her a liability. The high society friends who had fawned over her at the plaza abandoned her the moment her bank account shrank. She was forced to take an entry-level analyst position, starting at the exact bottom she had so arrogantly mocked me for occupying. Sitting in my grandmother's office, looking out over the sprawling Manhattan skyline, I realized something profound. I had spent my entire life terrified of my family's disapproval. I had twisted myself into knots, trying to shrink my presence to avoid their cruel jokes and their harsh judgments. I had believed that if I just stayed quiet, I would eventually earn my place. But as I drafted the new operational guidelines for my empire, I realized that I didn't need to earn a place at their table. I owned the building the table was sitting in. I had stripped them of their wealth, their status, and their control, but the true victory wasn't financial. The true victory was the profound, breathtaking silence in my mind. For the first time in 28 years, I wasn't bracing for a verbal attack. I wasn't waiting to be told I was stupid. I had established an ironclad boundary, completely removing their access to my life, my energy, and my future. I had finally stopped fighting for their validation, and in doing so, I had won the war. The hostile takeover of Whitford Properties sent shockwaves through the Manhattan real estate world, but the dust settled with remarkable speed. Once the inflated ego and toxic nepotism of my father were excised from the operational structure, the company didn't just stabilize, it thrived. I surrounded myself with a board of fierce, intelligent, and empathetic advisors. I didn't hide my dyslexia. I embraced it as a fundamental part of my operational style. I hired an exceptional executive assistant who managed the dense reading materials, allowing me to focus entirely on what I was actually brilliant at: macro strategy, architectural vision, and human connection. I possessed my grandmother's instinct for people, a skill that no Ivy League university could ever teach. Under my leadership, we secured massive, innovative development deals by treating our contractors and partners with the respect my father had always denied them. Whitford Properties became a titan not just of wealth, but of integrity. I never spoke to my parents or my sister again. They retreated to a smaller home in Connecticut, living off the modest stipend Eliner had secured for them, forever bitter, forever blaming everyone but themselves for their spectacular fall from grace. They remained trapped in a prison of their own arrogance while I was finally free. Sometimes, late at night, I stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, looking out over the glittering lights of the city I now help build. I think about the scared, 12-year-old girl crying in the library, convinced she was broken because the letters swam on the page. I think about my grandmother, placing her calloused hand over mine, telling me to look at the bones of a building, not the peeling paint. She left me a $92 million empire, but that wasn't her true legacy. Her true legacy was giving me the permission to finally see my own value. For 28 years, I let my worth be determined by people who judged value by credentials, by degrees, and by the superficial speed of academic performance. Eliner judged worth by character, by grit, and by the way a person treated those who couldn't fight back. And now, finally, I get to judge my own worth by my own standard, my own measure, and my own truth. A valuable lesson for the listener. If you recognize yourself in Dulce's story, if you have ever been the overlooked one, the scapegoat, the child told they would never amount to anything simply because they didn't fit a toxic family's rigid mold, I want you to internalize a profound truth. You do not need a secret inheritance to prove your value, and your worth is never determined by the people who are too blind to see it. We are often conditioned to believe that our family's assessment of our character is the ultimate truth. We internalize their cruel jokes, their dismissive sighs, and their blatant favoritism, convincing ourselves that we must be defective if the people who are supposed to love us treat us poorly. But toxic people do not judge you based on your actual value. They judge you based on how easily they can control you, exploit you, or use you to elevate their own fragile egos. When a family designates a golden child and a scapegoat, it has nothing to do with the actual merit of those children. It is a mechanism of control. The golden child is rewarded for blind compliance, and the scapegoat is punished for existing outside the narrative. Dulce's parents called her slow, not because she lacked intelligence, but because they lacked empathy. They were too arrogant to understand that brilliance comes in 1,000 different forms. The greatest tragedy is not being misunderstood by toxic people. The greatest tragedy is spending your life waiting for them to finally understand you. You must give yourself permission to stop seeking approval from people who are fundamentally committed to misunderstanding you. Boundaries aren't walls, they are doors. They let you decide who gets access to your life and on what terms. You do not need to destroy the people who hurt you to find peace, but you absolutely must stop letting them sit on the board of directors of your self-esteem. Stop waiting for the people who pushed you into the shadows to finally turn on the light. Step out of the dark, recognize the incredible strength it took to survive them, and start building your own empire. The real inheritance is the moment you finally realize that the power was inside you all along, and nobody can ever take it away.